Archaeologists have hailed a latest discovery in Peru as possibly the most exciting find of the decade. An almost perfectly well-preserved mummy, estimated to be almost 800 years old, has been discovered there. Our next report gets you more details.
What if everything we thought we knew about human history was built on a mistake? Not a small one, not a minor detail that needed correcting, a fundamental, structural mistake that erased an entire branch of humanity from our understanding of the past. In 2025, scientists did something that was considered virtually impossible. They extracted full genomes from mummies found in one of the hottest places on Earth, the Sahara Desert, and what they found did not just surprise the scientific community. It shattered a model that had been taught in universities for decades. It revealed a ghost population, a group of people who lived in isolation for 50,000 years, built cultures, buried their dead with care, survived ice ages, and then simply vanished without leaving a single genetic descendant alive today. And the Sahara was not alone. On the other side of the world, in the ancient burial sites of South America, researchers found something equally disturbing. 84 completely unique maternal lineages, all gone. Not a single one survived into the modern world. These are not fringe findings. These are peer-reviewed, published genomic studies that are forcing scientists to ask a question they never expected to ask. How many entire branches of humanity have we lost, and how many are we still missing? To understand why this matters as much as it does, we need to go back to where this story actually began. And it began not in a laboratory, but in the middle of the Libyan desert, with a single human jawbone. And before we reveal how scientists uncovered this lost branch of humanity, hit like and subscribe. Because discoveries like this change the way we see our entire past. In 2003, an archaeologist named Savino Dernier drove a four-wheel vehicle deep into southwestern Libya, into the Tadrat Akakus Mountains, a landscape so dry that rain might not fall for a decade. He was not there looking for mummies. He was looking for evidence of the Green Sahara, a period when this desert was something else entirely. On the second day of excavation at a site called the Takarakori Rock Shelter, his team scraped back a thin layer of sand and found a human jawbone, then a rib cage, then skin. Not fragments, not dust. Skin, intact, leathery, unmistakably human, preserved by the same brutal heat that should have destroyed it thousands of years ago. They had found a mummy, and then another, two women, both in their 40s, both buried wrapped in woven mats, both dead for roughly 7,000 years. And at the time, nobody fully understood what these two women would eventually reveal. It took 20 years, 3 separate research teams, and a technology that did not yet exist for the full picture to emerge. And when it did not just rewrite the story of the Sahara. It erased an entire branch of humanity from the map, and then put it back. The old model, and why everyone believed it. Now, before we get to what the DNA actually showed, it is important to understand what scientists believed before this discovery, because this is not a story about bad science. It is a story about how reasonable assumptions, each one perfectly logical on its own, can stack on top of each other and quietly lead you in the wrong direction for decades. For most of the 20th century, the scientific consensus about North Africa was straightforward. When the Sahara greened up between roughly 14,500 and 5,000 years ago, it became a corridor, not a desert, a savanna. 3.6 million square miles of grassland, dotted with permanent lakes, threaded with rivers, home to hippos, elephants, and giraffes, and the people who hunted them. People from sub-Saharan Africa moved north. People from the Mediterranean coast moved south, genes mixed, cultures blended. The Green Sahara was a bridge connecting the two halves of the continent, the way a highway connects cities. This idea was elegant. It made geographic sense, and it was backed by real physical evidence. Thousands of rock paintings in the Tadra Takakus Mountains alone showed cattle herders with bows, women grinding grain, children playing near water. Pottery found at Saharan sites matched styles from the Nile Valley and from the Sahel, hundreds of kilometers in either direction. Stone tools from multiple distinct regional traditions were found mixed together in the same layers at the same sites. You could draw arrows on a map showing populations flowing back and forth across a green continent, and the arrows looked right. The model was published in textbooks, taught in universities, and for decades, nobody seriously questioned it. There was just one problem. Nobody had checked the DNA. Why no one checked the DNA? And I want to spend a moment here, because this is the part of the story that usually gets skipped over, but it is actually the most important part. The absence of genetic data was not laziness. It was a cascade of reasonable assumptions, each reinforcing the next. First, ancient DNA work depends on preservation. Cold climates are ideal. Permafrost in Siberia, limestone caves in northern Europe, high-altitude glaciers in the Andes. These are the environments where genetic material survives for thousands of years. The Sahara is the exact opposite. Daytime temperatures regularly exceed 50 degrees Celsius. Humidity is near zero. Ultraviolet radiation is relentless. DNA degrades fast in heat, and the Sahara is one of the hottest places on Earth. So for decades, geneticists simply did not bother trying. They assumed, with good reason, that any genetic material from Saharan remains would be too fragmented to read. Second, the archaeological evidence seemed to tell a perfectly clear story on its own. When you find Nile Valley pottery sitting in a Saharan campsite, the simplest explanation is that people carried it there. When you find cattle bones where only wild game was hunted before, the simplest explanation is that herders migrated in. Archaeology reads objects. It does not read bloodlines, and for most of the 20th century, nobody had a reliable way to distinguish between an idea that traveled and a person who traveled. Third, there was the sheer scale of the blank. North Africa is one of the least genetically sampled regions on Earth. By the early 2000s, Europe had hundreds of ancient genomes. The Near East was catching up. Sub-Saharan Africa had a growing data set. But between the Mediterranean coast and the Sahel, there was almost nothing. You cannot find a pattern in data that does not exist, and you cannot question a model when there is no competing evidence. The assumption was reasonable. It was also wrong. Why Takarakori was different. Here is the detail that changes everything, though. The reason Takarakori broke this pattern was not luck. It was geology. The rock shelter is not out in the open dunes. It is a deep overhang in a mountain range, shielded from direct sun, with stable interior temperatures that stay far below the scorching surface extremes. The bodies were buried in dry sand beneath the overhang, which created a micro-environment, essentially a natural desiccation chamber that preserved soft tissue in a region where preservation should have been impossible. Skin dried before bacteria could consume it. Collagen in the bones held together, and inside the densest tissues, tiny fragments of 7,000-year-old genetic material survived. The desert killed the DNA at every other site. This one, by geological accident, saved it. The 2025 breakthrough. In 2019, researchers extracted mitochondrial DNA from both Takarakori women. Mitochondrial DNA passes only from mother to child, so it is a narrow window, useful for broad strokes, but not for the kind of detailed population analysis that answers hard questions. Still, even that limited data hinted at something strange. The maternal lineages did not look like what anyone expected for this region, but the real breakthrough came in April 2025. Natada Salem, a paleogeneticist at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, and senior author Johannes Kraus, the institute's director, published a study in Nature that changed the picture completely. They had done what most geneticists believed was impossible. They had sequenced the full genomes of both Takarakori women, not just the mitochondrial fragment, but the complete genome, the first whole genomes ever recovered from one of the hottest environments on Earth. Salem described the process in interviews. The DNA came from teeth and leg bones, the densest tissues in the body, the ones most likely to shield genetic material from heat. The fragments were short, degraded, and riddled with the chemical damage signatures that accumulate over thousands of years. Modern sequencing technology reads these fragments like reconstructing a shredded document. Millions of tiny, overlapping pieces scanned and computationally reassembled into something readable. It is slow work. It fails often. But when it works, it gives you something that no amount of pottery analysis or rock art interpretation can provide. The actual genetic identity of a person who has been dead for 7,000 years. Salem's team compared the two genomes against 795 present-day individuals from Africa, the Near East, and Southern Europe, along with 117 ancient genomes from the same regions. And this is where the story turns, the disturbing result. The Takarakori women did not carry sub-Saharan African ancestry. None. Zero. In a region that was supposed to be a genetic bridge between North and South, these two women had no connection whatsoever to the populations south of the Sahara. Instead, they belonged to a lineage that had never been seen before. Not in any living person, not in any ancient genome on record anywhere in the world. A lineage that, according to the genomic analysis, split from sub-Saharan African populations roughly 50,000 years ago, right around the time modern humans were beginning the Great Migration out of Africa. While one branch of humanity left the continent to populate Europe and Asia, this group stayed. They stayed in North Africa, and they stayed isolated for tens of thousands of years. Scientists call this a ghost population, a group whose existence had only ever been glimpsed as faint statistical echoes in the DNA of living people, but whose actual remains had never been found. Until now, three things make this finding especially hard to dismiss. First, the continuity. The Takarakori genomes are closest to 15,000-year-old hunter-gatherers from Tafarolt Cave in Morocco, a site associated with the Ibero-Maurusian stone tool culture. Despite being separated by 8,000 years and roughly 2,000 kilometers, both populations share the same deep North African genetic signature, and both are equally distant from sub-Saharan Africans. That is not coincidence. That is continuity across millennia. Second, what it rules out. The Green Sahara was not a migration corridor, at least not genetically. Despite the lush conditions, despite the lakes and rivers and grasslands, despite all the archaeological evidence of cultural exchange, the actual people on either side of the Sahara did not mix. Culture traveled. Genes did not. Harold Ringbauer, a population geneticist at Max Planck, noted that this level of genetic isolation is extraordinary, especially compared to Europe, where populations mixed extensively during the exact same period. Third, what it implies. The Takarakori women carried Neanderthal DNA, but only about 1/10 the amount found in modern non-African humans, around 0.15%, compared to the usual 1 to 2%. That trace amount could only have been acquired outside Africa, since Neanderthals lived in Eurasia. So at some very early point, a small amount of genetic material from outside the continent filtered in. But after that, the door closed. This population lived in near-total genetic isolation for tens of thousands of years, and then they were gone. The pattern repeats: South America. Now, if this were an isolated finding, you could file it away as a fascinating anomaly. But here is where the story becomes genuinely unsettling, because Takarakori is not isolated. It is part of a pattern. In 2016, geneticist Bastian Lamas at the University of Adelaide sequenced mitochondrial genomes from 92 pre-Columbian mummies and skeletons across South America, dated between 500 and 8,600 years old. These were carefully selected remains from Bolivia, Chile, Peru, Argentina, and Mexico, representing the broadest possible geographic and temporal range. His team identified 84 distinct genetic lineages, 84 separate maternal lines representing the full diversity of the ancient Americas. Not one of those lineages exists in any living person today. Let that settle for a moment. 92 ancient individuals, 84 unique lineages, all extinct. The researchers did not need complex statistical modeling to understand the scale of loss. They simply compared the ancient sequences to modern databases and found nothing. No matches, no descendants, no survivors. Lamas described it bluntly. Some of those populations were wiped out completely when Europeans arrived. The genetic analysis also revealed something about how the Americas were originally settled. The ancestors of these populations had split from Siberian groups about 23,000 years ago, spent roughly 6,000 years isolated in Beringia, the land bridge between Asia and Alaska, then fanned outward about 16,000 years ago. After that initial expansion, populations settled into geographic pockets and stayed put. Lineages became distinct and localized. And then after European contact in the late 1400s, most of those localized lineages simply disappeared. It is worth pausing here for one additional detail, because it connects to something even older. The oldest artificially mummified bodies on Earth are not Egyptian. They are the Chinchorro mummies of northern Chile, dating back 7,400 years, a full 2,000 years before the first Egyptian mummification. The Chinchorro were coastal fishers who embalmed everyone, not just elites, including infants and unborn children. Their mitochondrial DNA belongs to haplogroup A2. We do not yet have their full genome, but given what the Adelaide study found, the chances that their specific genetic lineage survives today are very slim. Colombia, the third thread. And then, also in 2025, a third thread emerged. A study published in Science Advances reported the first ancient genomes ever recovered from Colombia. A team led by Kim Louise Kretek at the Senckenberg Center for Human Evolution analyzed 21 individuals from the Bogotá Altiplano, some dating back 6,000 years. These were the first ancient genomes from Colombia ever published in the scientific record. 7 of the oldest belonged to a population that had never been documented anywhere. Their DNA matched no known ancient group in the Americas. It matched no modern population anywhere on Earth. And by 2,000 years ago, they had vanished completely, replaced by a genetically different group with ties to Central America. Kretek put it plainly. The genes were not passed on. There was a complete exchange of the population. Christina Warriner at Harvard University called Colombia a blank spot in ancient DNA studies of the Americas, making these genomes particularly significant. 3 threads, 1 conclusion. So now we have 3 separate threads converging on the same deeply unsettling conclusion. In the Sahara, a 50,000-year-old lineage that persisted in isolation until it vanished. In South America, 84 maternal lines erased after European contact. In Colombia, a founding population that disappeared long before Europeans ever arrived, replaced entirely by later migrants from Central America. Different continents, different timescales, different causes of disappearance, but the same result. Entire populations alive for millennia, gone without a single genetic trace. The debate. The debate around these findings is real, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Some researchers argue that the Takarakori sample is too small to draw sweeping conclusions about North African population history. 2 individuals from one rock shelter cannot represent an entire region. That is a legitimate point. Others note that the Green Sahara ecosystems, with their isolated mountain ranges, internal lakes, and distinct ecological zones, may have created natural barriers that kept communities apart without needing a dramatic narrative to explain the isolation. For the South American data, sampling of modern indigenous populations remains incomplete. It is possible, though increasingly unlikely, that some of those 84 lineages survive in communities that have not yet been genetically tested. I rewrote this section multiple times because the evidence genuinely pulls in 2 directions. I am not fully convinced the corridor model for the Sahara is entirely dead. Cultural exchange clearly happened. Pottery styles moved. Livestock practices spread. Savino Dernier himself noted that the Takarakori community was not culturally isolated. They traded. They adopted herding. They participated in regional networks. The question is whether ideas can travel without people. And the genetic evidence says, at least in this case, they can. That is a genuinely surprising result, and it deserves more investigation before anyone closes the book on it. The bigger picture. But what is not in debate is the larger implication. The human family tree is not a clean branching diagram. It is a tangle of lines that split, drifted, briefly connected, and then disappeared. We know about the branches that survived. We built our entire understanding of human history around them. But the mummies are telling us that the branches we lost may have been just as numerous, just as widespread, and just as old as the ones that endured. And here is what keeps pulling me back to this story, weeks after I first read the paper. The Takarakori women were not living in some marginal corner of the world. They were herders. They had pottery. They wove baskets and mats. They buried their dead with care, wrapped in textiles, placed in sheltered ground. They lived in a landscape of lakes and grasslands and mountain forests that we can barely imagine when we look at the Sahara today. Their effective population was estimated at around 1,000 people, small enough to know everyone by name, large enough to sustain a culture across generations. And then the rain stopped, the lakes dried, the savanna turned to sand, and a lineage that had persisted for 50,000 years, that had weathered ice ages, climate shifts, and the entire Neolithic revolution, went silent. Mum, when the Sahara expanded to its greatest extent, how many communities were there? How far did they range? Johannes Krauss put it simply, we do not know where they were hanging out between 50,000 years ago and 15,000 years ago. Natada Salem and her team are already searching for more ancient genomes across the Sahara, but the odds of finding preservation like Takarakori again are slim. The desert does not give up its dead easily. And that, honestly, is the most important part of this story. Not the answers we found, but the scale of what we have not yet asked. Because if a ghost population can hide in plain sight in the Sahara for 50,000 years, with the rock art and the pottery and the buried dead right there above the surface, how many others are we still walking past? We are still looking, and we are nowhere near done. If this is the kind of deep dive you want more of, we are working on a full series exploring vanished lineages across the Americas and Africa. Subscribing is the best way to make sure you catch it when it drops. And if you found this video worthwhile, sharing it genuinely helps this kind of research reach the people who deserve to know about it. See you in the next one.